Thank you, Amy. After 40 years of church membership and community, church communities, and 30 years in church leadership, I've thought a lot about the church or church in a broader sense. Now, I'm only celebrating the 28th anniversary of my 36th birthday, but I've had enough time in my life to think about what was the experience that I had in church? What was the experience of people who came to my church? And what was the experience of people who weren't interested and didn't want to come? The question, of course, is what is church? There's a couple different ways to think about this. The generally accepted definition of church is that the word church comes from an Old English word, kirk, and the phrase Kyriakon Doma, house of the Lord, goes back to the 4th century when places for Christian gatherings and worship began to call themselves church. But in the collection of Christian writings that we call the New Testament, the ancient Christians used the word ecclesia when they talked about getting together. And the word ecclesia is a Greek word, and it basically means a gathering of people, an assembly of people. So we could say then that when we get together on Sundays, we're Heartland Unitarian gathering of people. So the coming together is what creates this special body that we have come to call church in our society. But beyond that, beyond the gathering of people together, we generally expect something from church. We expect certain things of a church and what going to church means, and it depends on the culture of the society that you live in that determines what those expectations may be. And they have developed over time. Why do people want to go to church? Why get out of bed and remember the old days when we used to actually go to a building? Now it's, why should I get up and log on to Zoom? So things have changed. But the idea of why go to church is not an easy question to answer. Now, in the United States, regular or most churches have an attendance of under 100, from 1 to 99. 59% of Protestant Christian churches have a membership or attendance below 100. But this is America, and we live with a capitalistic mindset bastioned in corporate models, and our expansionist roots drive us to bigger and better, or at least bigger, so many churches want to grow. And of course, there's good reasons to grow. There are more people to gather together to support one another. We increase the amount of resources we have to maintain gathering spaces. And if we want to positively impact the world that we live in, greater numbers often make a difference and can matter. And we can connect to our communities often in better ways when we are larger, when we grow. And when each of the two churches that I pastored in Indiana grew past 100 people in membership, I got a piece of paper that said, "Congratulations." And most of the other pastors I interacted with, I knew had churches that were lower than mine was. They were smaller than my 130 or so people. So I could walk as, I was the man when I walked into conferences and gatherings with those small church pastors. But then when I got into a conference with other pastors whose churches were 300, 500, 900, then I began to think, well, they're putting growth above teaching. They're putting their growth needs before theology. So I'd kind of look down on them, because we called that steeple envy. I won't say anything more about that. But certainly that is the case. We think that growth is the most important thing. So I've asked myself, what do people want from a church in order to engage with it? and it's very individualized and different. You know, not all people want churches to grow. In one of the churches that I pastored, and we were growing, and we could very clearly were on a growth trajectory. We gathered together in the board meeting. We talked about some of the things that we were going to do to facilitate further growth. And as I walked out of the church, an older member of our congregation walked beside me in the gravelly parking lot, and she said to me, "Don, I don't want my church to grow. I want it to still be that little church that I've always known and loved." Now, that was not the atmosphere that was in that board meeting, but it was her response. So for her, a small church is one that made more sense. The churches are very interesting. When I was in seminary, we had to read a book called Open Secrets by a retired pastor. And he said something or wrote something that really struck me. He said that seminaries are producing biblical theologians for churches who want them to preside at youth group spaghetti dinners. So some people want that, just a sense of friendly, fun community. The second church where I was a senior minister had been built in 1914, was the church of the more prominent citizens in the town over the past years. And every once in a while, someone that I didn't recognize would be walking around the church, and I'd go out to see them and introduce myself and ask them why they were at the church. And they would often, several times, people who said, "I just wanted to look around because they used to attend when they were children, and they wanted to see the church as it is now, and it reminded them or gave them good memories and good feelings about life when it was easier for them as a child." And then I'd ask them, "Well, where do you live now?" They'd say, "Right there in town." They weren't coming to our church. They were going to the big mega church up the road, even though they had this emotional connection to the church, because, as I said earlier, big is better in the minds of some. I spent a day with the senior minister of a church further north in Indiana who had grown from 72 people in worship to almost 900 in 5 years. So I wanted to know how he did it. And what he did was he stopped wearing robes, which in my denomination was very common. He stopped wearing robes and stoles, and he started wearing blue jeans and sandals. And he attributed that to the growth, the more casual approach. He sent me a videotape of one of his, this was back in the old days with tape. He sent me a videotape of his worship service, and he was dressed in a kind of a plaid casual shirt, blue jeans, and without any socks. He's wearing sandals. And then during the sermon, he kicked off his sandals and he was barefoot on the chancel, the stage. Now, which for our denomination wasn't too normal or regular, but for him, he wanted to reach people who wanted someone that they thought was just like them and not holding themselves up above themselves. But other churches have gone just the opposite way. They've rekindled their love for the ancient hymns, even chanting or incense, and that has an appeal for some people. So the question is then, can the church be for everybody? What is church? And when I talk about church, I'm not just talking about the Christian church, but I'm referring once again to the definition of the term. That means a gathering of people. And as a gathering of people, can that gathering be for everybody? Or how can that gathering of people be more inclusive and draw people in so that we have a good group of people, a good number of people to support the institution of the church as it is, and then also to do good works, if you will, out into the communities? Should a church view growth above all else? In my former denomination, we lost 16 congregations in 2 years who left the denomination over gender equality issues. And the problem was that I saw it was that the average folk who were going to church had one view of gender equality, whereas the ministers and the theologians had another view. And unfortunately, I believe the ministerial aspects of church gave in to some of those who were negative towards gender equality, but it didn't help. They left regardless. Well, there's many ways to answer the question of what a church should be. I try to talk about some of the perspectives and experiences I had. However, just last week, I read a quote from Adrienne Rich, an American poet, essayist, and feminist. And she wrote in her book, Sources, this sentence that has just stuck with me for over a week. Just one sentence. She wrote, "There must be those among whom we can sit down and weep and still be counted as warriors." Let's say that again. There must be those among whom we can sit down and weep and still be counted as warriors. So many times I don't want to talk about my weaknesses or talk about my internal distresses because I don't want the person I'm speaking to think less of me. So I hold in some of my feelings and some of my thoughts in order to kind of maintain a certain sense of self. And in some ways, in our world, that's helpful and important. But somehow, the real me can get lost, can get covered up, to the point to where I can almost forget who I am. And I'm living somebody else's life, or living a life that is not the one that enervates me or gets me charged. So there must be those among whom I can sit and weep, pour out my feelings, whatever they are, and still be counted as warriors, to still be seen as an important part of our community, of our society. Not worrying about being diminished, but exalted for being human, and the struggle to be human that is a part of us. There must be a place. When I think about this subject about church, and as I thought about Adrienne Rich's words, sometimes when I try to get things organized in my head about things, I think back over some of the things that my mother told me when I was little. When I was little, I thought she didn't know what she was talking about. Of course, that stereotypical relationship with many of us and our parents. And it's true that as I lived on, I remember some of the things she said. But she told me at the time, she was Japanese. Well, she still is, but she's not alive. She recommended that I study about our ancestors who were samurai in Japan. And she talked about the dojo. Now, many of you are familiar with that term dojo. Usually we think of it today in America as a place where people go and they learn karate or jujitsu or taekwondo or something like that. And it's often is from someone who doesn't speak really good Japanese, but they're trying, they use all the Japanese words. And I did that for a few years myself and took martial arts, and I went to a dojo to learn. So it's associated with martial arts, but the actual meaning of the word dojo means place of the way. Place of the way. It comes from a Sanskrit word, bodhimanda, which means the place of awakening. And then the Japanese writing for the word dojos composed of two parts. One depicts somebody walking on a road, and the other is a depiction of the human throat, which surrounds the jugular vein, representing the very core and pulse of our life. So the word dojo then combines these two images: a person walking towards life. The way is a theme of life. And the dojo is a place where people would go, grow the self, and unite with the spirit through rigorous and compassionate life inquiry. Now, that last couple of sentences came from Dr. Richard Strozzi Heckler, who is an author and consultant. And I think that's so important that the dojo, maybe substituting the word in my mind, church, for dojo, the church, could it be a place when we can bring our true, authentic selves and not worry about the sadnesses and the fears and the angers, as well as the joys in our life, knowing that we're not diminished for proving that or showing that we're human, but that we're loved, we're cared for, that we're still considered an important human being. Justice. I think church should be that kind of a place. Should there be spaghetti dinners? I love spaghetti. I'll go to spaghetti dinners. But we have to nurture something else, that inner part of who we are, that yearns for a better world, that yearns for a better experience in the world, in the lives that we live. There is fear in life. The poem I read in the beginning, the first time I read it, I thought, oh my gosh, I don't see it so positive. It's basically talking about transitions, but the ultimate transition is into the unknown. And so I think for us, each day ahead of us, it's a day of the unknown. And we need support. So the programs of a church, this is just me riffing on this kind of theme, I guess. The programs of a church are varied, and they have various things. Social outreach, so important. Pastoral or caring ministries to people in the church, so very important. And educational aspects, so very important. But the most important thing is developing those relationships with one another that affirm us during our times of being up, our times of being down, that we have value as a human being. We are a gathering of people, a community of people who love and support. And as we develop that within the community of a church, that love then can extend out into the world and affect in a positive way so many things. But we often lay the foundation in church. That's where we lay the foundation of our actions and our thoughts. And we become energized to not just be a Sunday morning church person, but to get involved in learning, educating ourselves and others, and putting feet onto the principles that we say we believe in. The 6 foundational principles, the 7 qualities of our faith, those are so important, and they provide that source of movement and energy as we explore what it means to be church. Blessed be.